Hi guys, so as you have probably heard by now, Netflix is dropping a brand new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie on the 18th of February, and I thought what a perfect time it was to revisit the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre released in 1974 and review it for you guys. But as I began to write my notes on this film and research further into it, I began to realise that this is probably not going to be a review that follows my normal structure of movie facts and then positives, negatives and mixed aspects about the movie. This is probably going to be more like a review where we just discuss the film and have a deep dive into it. First of all, there aren't really any negatives that I can think of for this movie. It may not be to everybody's taste and that is okay, but I think this could quite possibly be a near perfect horror movie. And secondly, Texas Chainsaw Massacre has so many messages and themes within it that it is impossible to review this film without touching upon them. So I hope you guys enjoy as we just work our way through some aspects and themes of this movie, but just a heads up, this might be a long one, so make sure you're comfy and grab yourselves a hot drink and let's get going. So Texas Chainsaw Massacre was co-written and directed by Tobe Hooper, who also produced it and co-created the music for the movie. It has a fresh rating of 89% on Rotten Tomatoes and an audience rating of 82%, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre is considered to be one of the big franchises within horror, and the original is considered to be one of the most influential movies in the horror genre. So the story of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is very loosely based on and inspired by the real-life crimes of Ed Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield. If you didn't also know, Ed Gein is also the loose inspiration for Alfred Hitchcock's 1960s Psycho, and also the character of Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. But while Leatherface and some small aspects of the movie are inspired by Ed Gein, and the crawling text at the beginning of the movie does say that it is based on true events, the plot of the film is mostly fictional. So Texas Chainsaw follows a group of teens, including brother and sister Sally and Franklin, who travel to Texas because there have been reports of graves being robbed in the local area, and Sally and Franklin want to check that their grandfather's grave isn't one of them. When they get there, they decide to make a trip of it and visit their old childhood home. While on their trip, they run low on gas though and are unable to refill at the local gas stations due to shortages, and this leads to two of the teens, Kirk and Pam, visiting a nearby farm who they think might be able to loan them some gas as they can hear that they have a generator running. Whilst there, they are attacked by Leatherface, and when they don't return to their friends, another teen, Jerry, goes off in search of them and he is attacked by Leatherface as well. And when none of the three of them return, Sally and Franklin become worried and they go off in search of the others. What I love about this movie is that the progression of the story feels both really natural and really plausible. In 1973, America was in the middle of an oil crisis and people were struggling to fuel their vehicles and farm machinery. And so the idea of these teens being stuck without fuel for their van just really reflects the troubles of the time. And as a plot point for them to go off investigating, I think that it works really well. There are actually some really effective scares through the plot development of the film as well. In particular, when Sally is running through the woods being chased by Leatherface and she runs to the gas station for safety and she bumps into Drayton only for him to turn around and attack her. And it is revealed to Sally and the audience as well that the majority of people that the teens have met throughout the course of the day are part of the Sawyer family, and it shows you just how far out the dangers actually reach. And what's interesting about Texas Chainsaw Massacre is that this film doesn't have a happy ending. There is no cathartic resolution to the chaotic horrors that we have experienced throughout the movie. The Sawyers and Leatherface are not defeated, aside from the hitchhiker who is run over by the truck. They are neither killed nor arrested, and there is no punishment for the crimes that they have committed. And Sally, while she technically physically escapes from the Sawyers, she is clearly mentally broken by the end of the film. She has been tortured for hours on end, and her brother, her boyfriend, and her friends have all been killed. And I think that this helps add to the level of realism in the film. I think it's what helps makes Texas Chainsaw Massacre cut really close to the bone, in the fact that unlike Freddy and Jason, these villains are not always easily identifiable. and there's no punishment for their crimes. They get away with it, which is closer to our reality. And as for the characters in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I think that despite the group of teens in it not being the most interesting or the most fleshed out, for me personally, I think that it just doesn't matter in this film. I still like them and I still root for them to survive. They are more than just kill fodder, and they're not just stereotypes. I think that Franklin is quite an interesting character to watch as he regales his friends with stories from the slaughterhouse, and he's unable to understand that the people he's talking to are uncomfortable with what he's saying, and we see him slowly become fixated on the hitchhiker as he continually brings him up to his friends and his sister, and he becomes obsessively worried that the hitchhiker is going to return and harm them. And he even to a point starts to mimic the hitchhiker when he begins to blow raspberries in frustration. But as well as being interesting, he is also irritating and a very whiny character. But I think considering that he is a wheelchair bound person in an environment that is really not wheelchair friendly, I think that it is understandable, and he's not exactly helped by his friends. And Texas Chainsaw's final girl, Sally, doesn't exactly fit the mold of other final girls within other horror movies. She's not the focal point of the film, she's just one of the group but is the inevitable final survivor. And the villains within the film do not target her and her friends, it is just an unfortunate coincidence that they are killed off by the Sawyers. And for her final girl circuit, there is no discovery of bodies, and she doesn't kill or defeat the villain of the movie. But as Texas Chainsaw was released in 1974, it predates the blueprint that we now know for our final girls within horror. She is, however, a very capable person and manages to survive the horrors that are happening to her, but like I mentioned earlier, it is neither an easy or a happy victory. I think what makes her so likeable is that she feels really human and relatable in the way that she survives this film. There's a lot of running through fear and screaming, which I think a lot of us would do in a reaction to being chased by someone wielding a chainsaw, but once she is actually caught by the Sawyers, she tries to appeal to the nicer and human side of Drayton, asking him to free her, to not let them hurt her. And when that doesn't work, she tries another tactic of saying, I will do anything you want me to. So she's offering herself, she's using all the tools available to her to help her survive this situation. As for the villains of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, our main antagonist is of course Leatherface. He is one of the most famous horror villains alongside Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. But what distinguishes him apart from these others is that he himself to a point is a victim. He is a victim of familial bullying as he is verbally and sometimes physically pushed around by his family. I think there's also a very childlike element towards Leatherface, and while he is very clearly a villain, there's also a level of sympathy that you can feel towards him. And Leatherface and his brother, the hitchhiker, are the members of the Sawyer family who do what I would call the heavy lifting. They do the dirty work, they do the killing. And the third brother, Drayton, is the oldest in the family and also seems to be the leader of them, but he admits to not being able to take pleasure in killing. This comment about not being able to take pleasure in killing, and also when he says to Sally that there are some things that you have to do, it doesn't mean you have to like it, I think it's corroborating evidence to show that despite the fact that the Sawyer family are killing people, it's an added element of necessity rather than just for fun. Film scholar and Professor Robin Wood actually describes the Sawyer family as being victims of industrial capitalism. They lose their jobs and their income due to technological advances, making their jobs and their skills in the slaughterhouse obsolete. And the hitchhiker actually speaks about this himself to the group of teens in the van. It's also interesting that the Sawyer family are pretty much victims of trespassing and home invasion in the movie, because Kirk, Pam and Jerry all enter the Sawyer house without invitation, and you can also see in a scene after Leatherface has attacked the third teen that he's becoming quite distressed by these people coming into his home. They may kill people, but the Sawyer family don't want their peace and their safe space being disturbed. And as I said earlier, a lot of the killing that they do is out of necessity. And what we also see through the film is that they are not wasteful in whatever they kill, whether it's human or animal. They use the meat for food, and they use the skins and the furs and the bones for decor around the house. The kills in Texas Chainsaw Massacre are actually not as violent and gory as people seem to think or seem to remember. There is very little blood seen on screen, and Franklin is actually the only person to be killed with a chainsaw, and even then you don't see a great deal because this is done in the darkness of night. The other teens are killed and treated in the same way that animals would be in a slaughterhouse. There is of course intent of violence in the kills and a very disturbing level to them, but what the movie does is highlight that while this is done daily to animals, it only becomes horrifying once it is done to human beings. Kirk's death, the first person to be killed in the film, is actually foreshadowed earlier on, when the teens are in the van talking about methods used by the slaughterhouse and how ineffective using a hammer to the head was. Kirk is killed in this same way and suffers the side effect that they were saying made it so ineffective and cruel to the animals. As for the setting of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, what stands out the most to me is the fact that the majority of the horrors take place in the light and during the daytime. This feels uneasy because it's going against the comforting rules that have been set out by the majority of horror films. Aside from a handful of daytime horror films like Midsommar, the rule is generally that the dangers are in the dark at night, and once the sun comes up and you hit the daytime, generally you're hitting the safe zone. I also find the vast open space of the Texas countryside quite scary within itself. Everything just feels so vast and you feel so isolated, and it feels like you are so far from help and safety when you're in one of these houses. And because it's set during the summer in Texas, everything just feels really scorched and burnt out, and all the buildings feel really run down as well, and this all helps add to the aesthetic of the movie. But the exterior of the Sawyer's house actually looks really pretty. There are sunflowers growing, there's a swing seat in the garden, rose bushes, and the whole house is painted bright white. And as we see it in the daylight, everything feels just really warm and really bright and really inviting. But this is very, very contrasted to the interiors of the Sawyer house, which are incredibly decorated with peeling wallpaper, and everything feels a lot more shadowy, and there's animal furs and skins hung up and bones and skulls everywhere. Pam enters a room where the floor is covered in chicken feathers and she knocks over a jar that is full of human teeth, and there's decor furniture made out of human and animal bones and skulls. For me, the production of this movie is really what helps make it stand out. Robert Burns, the production designer, really helped make this movie what it is and really helped create that unsettling atmosphere within the Sawyer house. He designed and created a lot of the decor and the furniture within it, and he would actually drive around local farms asking for animal bones to use for his creations. And between these prop designs and the set dressing and the sound design and the erratic jump cuts, the dinner scene is possibly one of the most famous scenes from the movie and one of the most unpleasant and uncomfortable scenes that I have watched in a film. It's certainly not an enjoyable watch, but it is a thoroughly effective one. From what I can tell, there seems to be a little bit of disagreement over the length of film time that it took to film the dinner scene, but from what I found out, it seems to be between 26 and 36 hours straight. Now bear in mind that this was in the middle of summer in Texas, in a room that had no fans and no ventilation, with windows that were blacked out, and the room was filled with filming lights, so this was not a pleasant place to be for 26 to 36 hours straight. The temperatures in the room got so high that it actually began to cook the meat that they were using in the scene and really began to stink the place out. And between the high temperatures and the smell, there were members of the cast and crew, including Tobe Hooper, who had to leave the room to go and throw up and then come back and finish filming. Texas Chainsaw Massacre doesn't use an orchestral score within the film, unlike a lot of its contemporary peers. Instead, it opted for mechanical and practical sounds taken from farm machinery, generator and chainsaw motors, and animal sounds. And a lot of the animal sounds were ones of them in distress to create an unpleasant feeling in the viewer. And I think the sound design is an element of the movie that helps distinguish it from its peers and also makes it so much more memorable. And as people misremember the level of violence and gore within the film, I think the sound design is really in part to blame for this, because It creates a high and maintained level of anxiety throughout the film, and it almost fills in for what is missing visually, and it also makes Texas Chainsaw, especially in the dinner scene and the end of the film, it makes it an unpleasant viewing experience even if you're closing your eyes. And the final aspect of Texas Chainsaw Massacre that I want to talk to you about are the themes throughout the film. Texas Chainsaw Massacre has been studied and pulled apart by academics and scholars alike, and this is because it is chock full of messages and themes throughout, ones of familial bullying, politics, economy, and animal rights. One of the themes running throughout the film is the idea of the public and the private version of things. So, for example, a large number of people eat meat, but not many of them may know what happens to the meat or how the animals are killed. So you have the public consumption of the meat and the private creation of the meat. The Sawyer house itself from the outside looks almost idyllic. It has a public facade of peaceful farm life, but it hides the macabre horrors within of the private life of the Sawyers. Sorry if the camera's moved a little bit, I had to plug my camera in because the battery was about to die. And you could also say that Drayton Sawyer himself falls into this category. Publicly, he seems like the owner of the gas station who can provide safety for Sally. But privately he is a member of the Sawyer family and is still a danger to Sally. Another theme that runs throughout the film is that of eyes and perspective and things happening that aren't seen or things seen that aren't spoken about. I think the most obvious example would be the uncomfortable and erratic close-ups of Sally's bloodshot eyes wide with terror at the dinner scene. And of course there's also the drunk local at the graveyard at the beginning of the film who says, "Things happen hereabout, they don't talk about, I see things." And when Pam is in the van reading everybody's horoscopes, when she reads Sally's horoscope, it reads, "There are moments when we cannot believe that what is happening is really true. Pinch yourself and you may find out that it is." There's also the shot in the van where we see a herd of cattle in the slaughterhouse, which is meant to be the view of the teens in the van directly after they've been talking about the kill methods within a slaughterhouse. This shot is then reversed instantly, and we then see the van driving along the road from within the cattle pen in the slaughterhouse, and this is meant to be from the cattle's perspective. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is also considered to be a very pro-vegetarian film because of its animal rights content and themes. I mentioned earlier that parallels are drawn between the way animals are killed in the slaughterhouse and how the teens are then killed later, but what the movie does through it happening to humans is highlight the barbarity of it. Tobe Hooper himself actually stopped eating meat while filming Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Guillermo del Toro also became a vegetarian after watching the film. Texas Chainsaw Massacre has also often been considered an allegory for the Vietnam War. While the film was being made and released, America was in the final years of the Vietnam War, which ended in 1975. And between that and Watergate and a killer targeting people in New York City, it was a really dark time for America, especially for its youth, who had grown up in a time that seemed both hopeless and violent, and they had been lied to by their leaders, the same leaders that were drafting them to go off and fight. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre does a really good job of capturing and portraying the fear and the anger of the times. But I think this is also what makes Texas Chainsaw Massacre so popular, in that it is still relevant through the decades that have followed, and this has helped make it a timeless classic. So despite being full of messages and themes, I still think that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is easily accessible to all audiences. It is full of stunning and intriguing visuals and is really not dialogue heavy. Texas Chainsaw Massacre still holds up today. It stands the test of time, and I think that it has aged really well because it is still relevant to today and because everything is done practically and subtly. The reason why it is considered so scary, in my opinion, is because the majority of the violence is left to your own imagination, so the individual audience is able to project their own fears onto it. Texas Chainsaw Massacre predates Friday the 13th, Halloween and Black Christmas, and feels like a very distinct horror movie. It feels more like an experimental film, and this is because it predates all of the blueprints and tropes that are so set in stone now that we are now actually parodying them. So I first watched the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre years ago when I was a teenager, and I remember liking it, but not as much as I liked the 2003 remake, which had actually been the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie that I watched. But after revisiting it all these years later as a much more seasoned horror fan and cinema fan in general, I was absolutely blown away by it, and it has very easily and very effortlessly crept into my favourite horror movie list. I'd love to know what you guys think of this movie. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Or do you just appreciate it for the influential horror movie that it is? My next episode coming out will be a review of the brand new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie coming on the 18th of February, and I'm hoping to drop that episode at the beginning of next week. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys.